presiding bishop and leader of the Shrine of the Black Madonna of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, Jeramogi Kamathi. My name is Babu Kafense Chike, and I'm a longtime member of the church as well. And we wanted to get into a discussion about today's sermon, or the sermon that you will see for those of you who are viewing. And we urge you, of course, you can make comments on the live stream, and we urge you to like us and to share the broadcast broadly. And again, the sermon was titled A Defining Moment. And Jeramogi, I'd like to just ask you if you could maybe begin by elaborating on what you mean by a defining moment, and maybe you could also include your references to our people being asleep and needing a sense of urgency.
Well, a defining moment is a moment that changes everything. The problem with a defining moment is that most people, historically, people in defining moments don't understand it to be a defining moment while they're in it. They don't understand the significance of the moment. They don't understand how all subsequent outcomes are going to be shaped by what's done in this particular moment. And so we usually miss the opportunity to shape those moments to our advantage. We usually end up looking backward at them in the wake of as we're standing in the wake of the consequences. And from those consequences, we understand that that was a defining moment. There are a lot of places in history where this happens, where we recognize something different was possible, or something was taking place that was altering our circumstance, but we only understand it after it has been shaped. So getting people to understand the signs of the times and the conditions that we're in as being unique and leading to a certain outcome. Most people are not paying enough attention to recognize that it's leading to a certain outcome, and this outcome can be catastrophic. And speaking of to our particular times, this whole convergence of white people being desperate and feeling that their number one, their core value of their both personal self-image and the core value of their civilization being white supremacy is at threat. And they're reacting as if they're acting like people who their foundational beliefs are being attacked and eroded. And when people's foundational beliefs are attacked, they go crazy. And so they're doing things now that they weren't doing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's not anything that we've experienced in our history, because they've never felt really threatened. They now feel threatened, and that's very dangerous for us, because people that feel threatened are not rational. And we don't feel necessarily threatened, although we've been threatened for the last 400 plus years. This is business as usual for us, so we don't really have our minds focused on the looming threat that they pose in their sense of threat and insecurity. So that makes it a defining moment, because every day we're moving closer and closer and closer toward some kind of resolution of this fear. And we don't seem to understand. We don't understand it because our beliefs are not being threatened that way. White people are in a state of threat. So that's our particular defining moment. It provides for us both an opportunity and a crisis, and we have to figure out what we're going to do with it.
And could you maybe briefly have there been other moments like this in our history here?
I think probably the closest one would be Reconstruction. In Reconstruction, there was an opportunity to create a different kind of country for us to do something different. I mean, you know, we got 200 black soldiers. The both sides have been at war for many years. They're tired of war. I mean, them 200 soldiers should have just kept on going to Washington.
200.
The 200,000 black soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
Are you saying they should have continued that struggle?
Yeah, they should have continued that struggle and gone straight on into Washington, D.C. and took control of the government. And it's if you're talking about like, but they were just happy to be free. But if you're talking about having the power to preserve your freedom,
mm-hmm.
that's a different kind of struggle, because the struggle is not over when you are physically not in chains. The struggle doesn't end until you have the power in your hands to make sure you never end up in chains again.
Yes. And I think part of what I was able to glean from the sermon, particularly in your reference to policy and how policy has the ability to impact our lives. And you kind of laid out for me a trajectory or a chronology of policies that were made that more or less relegated us to a place of being oppressed. Could you say a little more, maybe in a similar context as you did in the sermon, about the importance of policy and the relationship to policy, political power, and one of the solutions that you presented? You advocated for voting as a possible solution to stop the impending emergence of a Republican president, which essentially, what I was able to gain from the sermon was that this is a part of the strategy of the I forget what you called it. It's the
Project 2025.
Yes.
Well, policies govern. They govern how we live, how we interact. People with power create policies, and we are forced to live up under those rules. You can call it a policy, can be a law.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a policy, it can be a law. But it basically defines how you function in a society. What's legal, what's illegal, what you can be punished for, what you can be what restrictions you face, what you're permitted to do. And people in power establish those parameters. What I try to say in the sermon is that slavery was not the policy of what became the United States. It wasn't the United States yet, but it was a policy that developed over time, because it didn't start out that way. Black people coming to this country were not slaves in perpetuity. The earliest Black people were indentured servants. They had periods of time where they could like earn their freedom. It hadn't hardened yet into chattel slavery. So for that period of time, which was like it wasn't like till like the mid 17th century that it became any person born of a Black woman was a slave in perpetuity. So before that, white folks and Black folks were getting married and living together, and because they were working together and interacting and everything. But you know, like when they started joining together to fight back against the landowners, they said we have to break this up. So that's when whiteness was introduced. And when whiteness was introduced, whiteness by design, whiteness means white supremacy. That
yes.
So when that was introduced, white supremacy, black inferiority, and black people are born of a black woman. If you're born of a black woman, you're a slave in perpetuity. That's because white men were still raping black women and they were having children, and their children could have a claim to be free because their fathers were free. But they said, no, if you're born of a black woman, you're a slave in perpetuity. So there's no way out. But that was a policy. It didn't start like that. Somebody decided this is in our best interest. This is in the interest of white supremacy that we do it this way. It wasn't done that way everywhere.
Right. And I do know, and maybe you could speak a little bit about this, I guess you did, that essentially another way that people say this is that, you know, when we learn the game, they change the rules.
All the time.
And I think what I'm reminded of is the O.J. Simpson case, when Johnny Cochran led a team of people that was able to get O.J. Simpson off. They began to, the legal system began to question and look at changing the rules for jury selection. And even here in Detroit, when, I don't know if you were familiar with the Malice Green murder.
Yeah.
Malice Green was murdered, and Coleman Young took some immediate action. The Recorder's Court was a court that was local to the city. And when these two white police officers were able to get off, the surrounding counties came together with the legislatures and got rid of the Recorder's Court, which was one of the most efficient courts in the country. So I'm just using these as examples of how the people with the power can change the rules. So it's sort of like they can continuously move the cheese, so to speak, and we continuously think that somehow we can get them to change. But I wanted to back up to something else you said. You talked about how white people are at this place of feeling threatened. This is in the conversation we're having now. And you also mentioned that we as Black people don't seem to feel threatened, which reminds me of what you said about us being asleep. What do you think, or maybe could you say what the programs are, or what we're doing, Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, to pull our people out of their sleep or to wake us up so that we can take action? And of course, this sermon to me is replete with examples, but if you could elaborate.
Well, the things that our program has been the same and consistent, which I try to really hone in on at the end of the message, that our program has been what it is all along, and it's a self-determination program, and it hasn't changed, it hasn't wavered, but it's the kind of program that Black people have the least amount of affinity for. It's like we don't have the stomach for it. Everything we're doing is trying to build self-determination for Black people, but we're swimming against the stream and walking uphill, because you see those T-shirts, Detroit versus everybody. It's BCN versus everybody. we walking uphill trying to convince Black people that building our own is the only way that we can secure our future. And Black people are of the opinion, well, if we can integrate, if I can have personal success, if I can gain wealth, if I can somehow tap into the benefits of the system, that I too can benefit and be free. I can be comfortable and happy, and I don't have to come together with a group of people and build our own to do that. And so we keep bumping our head. We keep trying to change the law, change the rules, make moral appeal to either through democratic arguments or through Christian arguments that we need to be treated more fairly and responsibly. And that is an argument that we can make. It makes great sense. We've argued it ingeniously, but in the final analysis, we don't control that decision. The people with power control that decision, and they decide whether or not they want to treat us differently. They decide whether or not they want to be fair. They decide whether or not it's in their interest to do something different. And they always ultimately come to the same conclusion, that it's in my interest to keep things as they are, or as close as they are as I can make them, because I have an advantage that is built into the structure of society. This society advantages me. I wanted to advantage my children and my children's children. And I don't want to remove those advantages so it can be more fair toward you. So the power is never in our hands. We're always appealing. Like I said, it's like begging somebody to love you, but they don't love you.
Mm-hmm.
And you got these eloquent arguments and this beautiful rap, and you writing this wonderful music, and you doing everything you can to inspire love, but they don't love you. But no matter what you do, the power is not in your hands. The power is in their hands, because they have to decide to go along with what you're talking about. And they simply do the calculation and say, it's not in my interest. So I'm gonna double down on white supremacy.
So maybe say what I'm hearing, and part of what you're saying now is that we expect them to share power or to give us some power. And I mean, does that historically happen? Do
No.
people just give power or share it?
No, you can go through history, and the wisest of people have not been wise enough to share power, even when it was in their interest. They don't share power. They always maintain the upper hand, and so our only recourse is to break away and take the power out of their hands and become
build power, maybe.
to build power for ourselves, so the decision is in our court, not in theirs.
Which goes back to the idea of self-determination.
Goes back to the idea of self-determination, and goes back to the whole program of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church. Everything we are doing, everything we've done has been about building power for ourselves. Our problem is we're way ahead of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And it may take 100 years for Black people to catch up, to come to the place where they determine, they come to say, you know, we're going to have to do it ourselves. But we will serve as a template, as an example, as a compass as to how you build self-determination. Because our history is a guide that it can be done, that a small group of people, relatively small group of people, can come together, build their own institutions, create more control over their own destiny, and work to protect themselves against a hostile society by self-ownership and by seeking political power that controls where they live. That is an example that can be replicated. And so our, like you said, Marcus Garvey is an example. Marcus Garvey was an example of Black people coming together and building for ourselves. It inspired people in subsequent generations to try to do the same thing. Well, the same thing is true for us. We become an example of Black self-determination in an enemy system. And it creates an example of what people in subsequent generations can do to take control of their own destiny.
Yeah, another thing that I liked about the sermon is the scriptural reference that you use in terms of the Israelites in Egypt, Joseph going from being maybe subjugated or oppressed to becoming a part of the political machinery, or the Pharaoh's house, so to speak, and how the Israelites had become to think or act like they were Egyptians. because they had that favor, so to speak. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little more and how it relates to this defining moment that we're in?
Well, I mean, I was using it as a parallel to what happened to us. I mean, you're in a society. First of all, it wasn't like there was a nation that came into Egypt. It was Joseph's family. It was only about 70 people, his brothers and their wives and children. And they came in because they were starving to death. And normally they would not have been allowed to be in, but the Nile River, the annual inundation of the Nile, where the flood comes and it fertilizes the soil on both sides of the Nile, ensured that they were not in a famine. They will always be ready to eat. And Joseph had been the architect of the program to store up food because hard times are coming. So when Joseph had guided Pharaoh to store up the grain houses for food for hard times are coming, when Joseph's family came into Egypt, Pharaoh welcomed them and gave them a place to stay and where they were able to earn a good living. And you talk about 430 years of a good living, of things being pretty good for them. But they were in the midst of another people's society. And so the only customs, traditions, values that they were being socialized to become Egyptian. And so they came to understand themselves to be Egyptians. They thought there was no difference between them and the Egyptians. Matter of fact, there's a scripture about, God making a difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians, that there was a difference. But in their minds, there was no difference. They were comfortable and living pretty good over a long period of time in somebody else's country. The same way you could say that any group of people that come into a country and establish businesses and communities, and they're speaking the language, they're acknowledging the holidays and the history of that particular country, and they adopt it as their own. So they come to identify. And when this other Pharaoh comes along and says, they're really not Egyptian. Just like people come along and say, we're really not real Americans.
Meaning Black folks.
Black people are not real Americans. And that is the position of white nationalists, is that we're not real Americans. We're in America, but we're not real Americans. And so when they talk about the American people want this and the American people want that, and the American people demand we do this, when those politicians say the American people, they're talking about the people they deem to be real Americans, not us.
Which means white, essentially.
Right. White supremacy is the core value of this society. And no matter, they could talk about democracy or religion or anything, white supremacy is the core value. And so when they're talking, and it seems like they're talking in they're talking in terms that are not exact. They're not saying, they never have to say white. White supremacy is a default position. They never have to say it.
It's implied.
It's implied in everything.
That reminds me of the Southern strategy that was introduced by, I want to say, Atwood or
Lee Atwater.
Yes, where they decided, he advocated that we shift the focus from using derogatory terms like the N-word, and you use coded language, and the people know what the language is. But I'm also reminded about another sermon you did. I think it was called the Peckerwood Messiah or something like that.
Yeah.
And you talked about how, or as I think about it, it's like these people have been preparing for this moment from as far back as maybe when the North won the Civil War. Is that an accurate?
Well, the Civil War has never ended. I mean, the Civil War never ended because, I mean, the hostilities between the armies was ended at Appomattox in 1865. But the war never ended because you're dealing with two different versions of what it means to be American. See, the people in the South said, we're the real Americans. We're the real Americans because what we're doing is the way this country was founded. Now, y'all decided to do something different, and we fought y'all. You prevailed because you got the slave population to join in. And so you prevailed in the hostilities, but we're still the real Americans. And we still see that we are the way that the country ought to go. So they never have relented. They've never confessed, changed their ways. They believe that they're the real Americans, and that these other people who want to have a different policy toward Black people, that they have betrayed America. So they never stop fighting. They never stop fighting. They don't have armies fighting, but they've never changed their mentality. And that battle has been going on ever since.
And I think it really plays out in the legislative branch of the government. When you see people like, well, these are older people, Strom Thurmond and people like that, but you're seeing these people manifest. And I think is really illustrated with the January 6th, was that 2021 situation. Of course, I have a ton of more questions. This is very interesting, but are there any things that maybe I haven't touched on that you would maybe like to highlight in our conversation before we conclude this this edition of Afterwards?
Well, the one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that people don't understand. They don't think that there's nothing we can do. There are things we can do. All white people are not white nationalists. There is a coalition of progressive-minded people, non-white peoples, and that they comprise a majority of the country. And so if that coalition is active in the electoral process, they can prevent the white nationalists from getting control of the country. But the white nationalists are fired up and laser focused on gaining control of the country so that they can enact their policies toward Black people and non-white people and liberal white people. They can enact their policies. They're a minority, but if they get control of the country, it doesn't make a difference who's a majority and who's a minority. It's who's in control. And they can create whatever policies and laws they want to. So we can't let that happen. The first line of defense is we have to overwhelm the electoral process with enough numbers to keep them from getting control of the government.
Wouldn't that have to be something that we would have to continuously engage in beyond 1 or 2 elections?
Yeah. If we did it within 2, 3 elections, the white nationalist numbers would drop because they're old. They're old and dying.
Okay.
They're old and dying, and this is their desperate last gasp attempt to impose their vision of the world on the country. They understand that this is it. This is Custer's last stand. And so they understand if the 2 election cycles go by, the younger people will naturally become involved in the process. To tell you the truth, if the younger people were involved right now, it would overwhelm the white nationalists. But the younger people don't tend to not vote or not think it's important. They don't have the long memory to understand. They don't really understand what they're involved in. They don't have the kind of consciousness nor the sense of urgency. And so that's why we have to keep talking about it enough for them to come to understand. Even if you don't understand it, trust us and vote. Trust the people who have seen more than you've seen and understand where this thing is headed, and just go vote. Because if you can keep them from gaining control of the government, then biology takes over. They're dying out, and younger, more progressive, more tolerant, more people of color are rising in terms of their numbers, and it'll make it impossible for them to win a national election. They'll still have areas of the country that they can, out rural areas, places where they predominate, but they won't be able to win a national election so that they can enact their policies and affect the whole country. So those are things we can do and do now. And we have to not only do that, we have to control where we live. Where we live has to be our sanctuary. We can't have people coming in having direct control over what we do, can and can't do from day to day, because they create policies we can't live with and are not in our interest.
I have one concluding question that I think what's been pressing for me. A lot of what you talked about in the sermon was in the context of African Americans, but aren't there global implications and the reason for African people everywhere? And the reason I say this, there seems to be in the legislative branch of government amongst the right-wing conservative Republicans or whatever, an increased effort to align themselves maybe indirectly with Putin, which of course is like one of the last bastions of the whitest countries. So is there some relationship there, and what are the global implications for what's playing out here in America? In the what is the plan? What is it called again? I'm sorry. 25
Project 2025.
Yes.
And that's probably what I should have named the sermon, Project 2025, because that's really the focus of the whole message.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. There's a white supremacist movement, a global white supremacist movement that includes New Zealand, Australia, Russia, all of Europe. You got Berlusconi in Italy. You have Marine Le Pen in France. You have the whole English group that decided that they was going to break away from the European Union with Brexit. All of that was white nationalism. And the United States got its own problem. The difference in the United States is that their problem is more immediate, because they're getting ready to lose the majority. In these other countries, they're not getting ready to do that. They just want to make sure that the non-white hordes of people who are coming to their shores, the people they have colonized, are now coming to where they live. And they're threatened by it, because if you get right down to it, you get right down to the biology of this thing, the black gene, the color gene is dominant, the white gene is recessive. So anytime people of color come into contact with white people, there are going to be fewer and fewer and fewer white people as time goes on. So they understand this, and that's when they talking about blood and soil and you will not replace us. They know exactly what they're talking about. They understand that biology is working against them, and they want their places to be as they were 500 years ago. France to be France, England to be England, Germany to be Germany, Italy to be Italy. They don't want any cross-pollination. And so there's a global nativist movement, a global white supremacist movement. And so they all feel threatened, and they all come together and recognize this common threat. And they recognize if they join together, they can control the non-white peoples of the world. They have more wealth, more power, and they can join together and work to maintain their position of global supremacy. So you're absolutely right. The United States is a very important linchpin, because if it goes the way of overcoming its white supremacist roots, then that's bad news for the rest of them. So it's a lot going on. It's a lot going on.
So this sounds to me like, and I know we have to stop, in evolution, for lack of a better word, beyond neo-colonialism, because this is a continued quest to hold on to this power.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, and it's inevitable. If there is no major intervention of some catastrophic kind, they're going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
They got to lose, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they don't lose, they're going to destroy everything. It would be good for all of existence for them to lose. It'll be good for the earth. It'll be good. It'll be good for everybody and everything. But if we just let the process play out, they would eventually lose just from the dominance of the color gene. So that there are books that deal with this phenomena, the decline of the great race and the great replacement theory. They're not like popular books, but they're popular among white nationalists.
Right.
That talk about this. So, when people get in this kind of situation, they get desperate and they're dangerous and they can do things that are truly diabolical. And now that Trump is saying the quiet part out loud, talking about vermin and his concentration camps for immigrants that he plans to put into place, he's repeating Mussolini and Hitler language, and
Yes.
that's where we are heading, and that's why this is a defining moment. It's the only recourse that they have to maintain power, and while we may think they're incapable and they would never do that, history shows us something different.
Okay, Jeramogi, we are out of time. I want to thank you for what I think was an excellent sermon, and even more so for this conversation, which has added clarity for me and hopefully all of those that watched the sermon and that watched this segment of Afterwards. And I would just conclude, because there's so much more to say, that this is an ongoing conversation.
It is. It is.
So this, I will say, will be continued. I want to thank people that may tune in to see this. We urge you to send comments, to reach out to Bila Kuta, which is our online version of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church. As you view us, we urge you to share this broadly, to like it, and to continue to come back for more of this ongoing conversation as we engage white supremacy and we work to exercise self-determination to build power for our people. I say Asante Sana, and thank you very much.